Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. When it comes to Gran Turismo, there have always been many things in these games that have somewhat annoyed me. We could talk about the AI, which, let's be honest, has never really been great, or how these games often restrict you from doing certain things for basically no reason. I even coined a term for it, pointlessly restrictive. But things like these are not exclusive to the newer titles. Even going back to the older games, which are much more widely loved, you can find no shortage of strange design choices and inconsistencies. However, there is one in particular that I feel doesn't really ever get talked about, and it all relates to these. In my opinion, lower-end race cars, such as touring cars and GT300s, are the most overlooked and useless cars in Gran Turismo. In almost all of these games, you could ignore them entirely and pretty much nothing would change. It's kinda bizarre when you sit down and really think about it. So today, I'm going to take you all on a mini retrospective as we look at how these cars have been used in each of the games. And along the way, hopefully we can understand where this strange trend came from and what could be done to improve the situation. But before we start, let me just make one thing clear. What is the difference between a touring car and a GT car? Well, simply, a touring car is a race car typically based on a standard commuter platform, usually a hatchback or sedan. A GT race car, on the other hand, is normally based on a performance car platform, like a sports car, GT, or supercar. The types of cars I'll be talking about in this video are touring cars, but also lower power GT cars that have comparable performance. Starting with the original Gran Turismo, you can find cars like these in a handful of late game events, those being the GT World Cup and the 3 endurance races. You'll find opponents using racing versions of the Nissan Primera, Honda Civic, Mazda Lantis, etc. However, since you will also find much faster GT style cars here, some even having twice the power of those already mentioned, as a player you'll have to use something faster to keep up. This taps into a fairly common trope of Gran Turismo, that being races with unbalanced opponents. Now, this is by no means specific to these types of cars, but in GT1 it renders them kind of pointless right off the bat. However, one plus point is that thanks to the racing modifications, these cars are pretty good value, so you're at least paying for what you get. With Gran Turismo 2, the situation is fairly similar. You can race modify many regular cars into racing versions, many taking inspiration from real-life race cars. However, there are some crucial differences. One is that the game actually has specific race events for these types of cars. The Super Touring Trophy is the perfect example, as the grid is made up of racing modified versions of many normal cars, like the Renault Laguna, Nissan Primera, and Peugeot 406. This event is of course mimicking the real-life Super Touring class of race cars that were popular in the 90s. Now, although you technically don't have to use one yourself, the only restriction being a limit of 493 horsepower, it does give you the perfect opportunity to try them out. This is great because it actually gives them purpose and adds more variety to the career. But GT2 also brought some purpose-built race cars on the lower end of the power spectrum. These are 8 of the GT300 cars that raced in the All Japan GT Championship in 1999. Now, their representation here isn't ideal because they each have around 400 to 450 horsepower, compared to their actual specs of roughly 300, but even still, they are some of the slower race cars in this game. To go along with these cars, we have the GT300 Championship, which consists of 5 races. Again, you can easily cheese this event, given the power limit is set at 591 horsepower, but if you want to race the AI on an even playing field, then using a GT300 yourself is the way to go. Like the Super Touring event, it adds a nice bit of variety and allows you to use these cars which you might otherwise not. As for the rest of the game, there isn't too much to say. All of the other events are intended for either road cars or faster race cars in the region of 500 plus horsepower. Bear in mind that with these types of cars, you can always upgrade them and then use them in other events if you want to, so they're never entirely useless. But giving these cars more power kind of fundamentally changes what they are and the niche they fill. And when we consider this from a game design perspective, you shouldn't be forced to heavily upgrade these cars to actually give them purpose. So just consider that as we talk about the games to come. With Gran Turismo 3, we saw a massive reduction in the number of cars, but conversely, a massive increase in the length of the career mode. When it came to events making use of these lower-end race cars, there really aren't many. However, when it comes to the cars themselves, there really aren't many either. There are only 2 GT300 cars in this game, so a GT300 championship is out of the question. That said, they are still used in a couple of ways. For example, the Beginner League GT World Championship. This event is interesting because as well as the GT300 Silvia and MRS, the rest of the grid is made up of rally cars. It's not a bad idea since in terms of performance they are reasonably similar and it gives these cars an opportunity to be used on even terms. However, over the many times I've played through this game, I don't think I've ever once done this championship with a race car, and that's mostly down to this event being in the Beginner League. An upgraded road car is really the way to go. We see this trend of GT300 cars and rally cars being paired also in arcade mode. They're all thrown together along with some interlopers, like the Renault Clio V6 race car and Spoon S2000 race car. Speaking of the Clio, there is actually a one-make race where it can be used in the professional league. However, your opponents all use the Clio V6 road car, so there's no real point. We can also mention the Beetle Cup. This event has you up against the VW New Beetle Cup car, giving you an opportunity to use one yourself. However, this is a beginner league event, and the Cup car can only be obtained by winning the German Touring Car Championship and the aforementioned Clio Cup, for some reason. So you're most likely going to have to use one of the Beetle road cars instead. In terms of touring cars, that's pretty much all GT3 has to offer, but it's quite well known that there was intended to be another one. This Alfa Romeo 156 touring car competed in the 2000 European Super Touring Cup, but it was sadly cut from the game before release for unknown reasons. In the career, there is one more event where you can find lower-end race cars as opponents, and that's the Amateur League GT All-Stars Championship. The Autobacks MRS, as well as a handful of rally cars, can show up. However, this event is similar to the ones from GT1 in that, because there are much faster opponents, these guys are kind of irrelevant. Of course, in real life, GT300 cars do race on track alongside faster GT500s, so there is some merit to the idea. However, at this point the series was yet to implement a true multi-class racing system, so the execution falls completely flat. But how would the situation change in Gran Turismo 4, where they would have a lot more cars to play with? GT4 brought a wide selection of cars here. They expanded the GT300 roster from 2 to 6 and reintroduced a proper assortment of touring cars. You can find the fictional Honda Integra and Mazda 6 touring cars, a BMW 320i that competed in the European Touring Car Championship, and even more. Add to this a few other race cars which had their power severely reduced from GT3 to bring them more in line with these cars. Considering the few other holdovers from GT3 meant that GT4 had a pretty solid selection of lower-end race cars. However, in spite of this, GT4 is actually one of the worst offenders when it comes to neglecting these types of cars. They barely factor into the career mode in any way. There is no event specifically for GT300s or touring cars like we saw in GT2. There are a couple of one-make events that return from GT3, like the Clio Cup and Beetle Cup, where the racing versions of each can be used. And the thumbnail image for the Real Circuit Tours event shows some real-life touring cars, but the event itself features mainly top-end prototypes. So, outside of the one-make races, there is just a single event where these types of cars are used as opponents, and that event is the Nürburgring 24 Hours. This does make sense, given that the real Nürburgring 24 Hours has always had a strong field of touring cars. In fact, up until 1999, touring cars and modified road cars were all that competed. Granted, none of them were GT300 cars like we see here, but it's close enough, I guess. However, here we encounter the classic issue of these cars being made redundant thanks to the presence of much faster opponents. You can find more powerful DTM cars as well as the Chaparral 2D, which is easily the toughest opponent. In total, there are 6 GT300s, so technically it is possible to have a grid comprised solely from them, but not likely. If you're decent at GT4, a GT300 or touring car is still a viable choice against the faster opponents, but given that this is a 24-hour race, the majority of players will simply never do do it anyway. This means that as a player working your way through this game, it's very possible that you will not only never drive these types of race cars, but rarely even see them outside of the dealerships. For a game that's as expansive as GT4, with so many different events utilizing various types of cars, this omission has always been really bizarre to me. It almost feels deliberate. If we go into arcade mode, we can see that the grouping of these cars with rally cars is still a thing, even if we never see it in the career mode itself. So, one usage for these race cars can be in the special conditions events on tarmac circuits. They are decently balanced with the rally cars, so this isn't a bad idea, but still not exactly ideal. With GT3, there weren't enough of these cars to really do much more with them, but GT4 simply doesn't have that excuse. We've now reached the PS3 era. Gran Turismo 5 brought with it yet more of these types of race cars, along with carrying over the ones from the PS2 games. There were 4 all-new GT300 models, albeit 3 of which were just updated versions of older ones, and a decent selection of others through the returning racing modifications. But if you thought that the situation would improve from GT4, you are sadly mistaken. If anything, it got worse. To my knowledge, I don't believe that a single lower-end race car, touring car, or GT300 car appears as an opponent in any event in GT5's career. The Nürburgring 24 Hours Endurance returns, and they don't even show up in that. It's now just solely GT cars, and even prototypes which have never raced in the real-life events. Even if we dig through the cut events that still have leftovers in the game files, there isn't much to see. Just the Clio Cup and Beetle Cup returning as one race event. GT5 truly was a massive letdown when it came to how these cars were used. In arcade mode, we can still observe the trend of these cars being paired with rally cars and also tuned cars, something that was even seen quite prominently in pre-release demos and screenshots. But when it came to the cars themselves, we would get even more through the Racing Car Pack DLC that arrived in October 2011. This pack brought the likes of the Honda CR-Z touring car, Mazda Roadster touring car, and even a Toyota Prius touring car. There were of course various others, but when it comes to focusing on lower-end race cars, those were the main 3. So, moving on to Gran Turismo 6, this game would have a greater selection of these types of race cars than any of the games that came before. But would they even be used in the career? Well, I'm pleased to say that yes, they would. For starters, there is a proper GT300 championship for the first time since all the way back in GT2. It utilizes each of the 10 existing GT300 cars, plus the new for GT6 Subaru BRZ as well, and even uses a double-file rolling start just like the real-life Super GT series. But it's not just the GT300s that have gotten some love. Also in the International A tier, you can find a couple of World Touring Car Championship events. The first of these, for cars in the 550 performance point range, does feature a solid selection of lower-end race cars, although the unbalanced grid rears its head again, with the leading opponents driving noticeably faster GT cars. However, given how crap the AI is in GT6, you can often still beat them using cars like these, so they still have purpose here. But an even better event for cars like these would be the World Circuit Tour. This set of 5 races features almost exclusively lower-end race cars, GT300s, touring cars, and also some rally cars to fill out the grid. It's essentially the perfect event for these types of cars. I kind of think of it like a successor to the Beginner League GT World Championship from GT3. You know, with retrospectives like these, I'm so used to saying, here's how GT5 went wrong, and here's how GT6 just repeated the same mistake. But it is genuinely refreshing to be able to praise Polyphony for actually recognizing a shortcoming of GT5 and improving on it in a meaningful way with GT6. Stuff like that doesn't happen too often. Of all of the games we've talked about so far, I think that GT6 handles these types of race cars the best. Really, I'm just as shocked as you are. But now we head into the current era of the franchise, starting with Gran Turismo Sport. The main difference between GT Sport and the previous games when it comes to these cars is the group system. This makes defining the types of cars I'm talking about a lot simpler, because now I can just say Group 4. The Group 4 class is made up of a decent selection of real and fictional touring cars and GT4 cars. This system of categorizing has its positives and negatives. On the upside, it makes things a lot more streamlined streamlined and easy to understand for players. As such, these cars can be used much more widely in the game as one of the clearly defined classes. The downside though is that it's just far less interesting. Group 4 is used in a pretty much identical way to Group 3 in this game. The only real difference is that the cars are slightly slower. GT Sport does have a basic career, the GT League, and Group 4 cars are used in specifically one event. GT Sport did present one interesting idea when it came to their usage though. In the mission events, you'll find a 1-hour race that takes the form of a multi-class event, with yourself driving a Group 3 car, but having to share the track with slower Group 4s. This is interesting because it's the sort of thing the older games were mimicking by having those unbalanced grids, where some cars were clearly a lot faster than others. To standardize this, much in the same way as real-life racing, is a solid idea. It uses the Group 4 cars in a different way by giving them purpose without you actually having to drive them. Sadly, beyond one other mission event, this is not an idea that stuck around in the series. And moving on to Gran Turismo 7, we're still in a pretty similar position. These lower-end race cars are defined by Group 4, either by the fact that they're part of it or that they're not. The one major difference here from GT Sport is that GT7 reintroduced performance points. Because GT Sport didn't have this, it meant that any race car that didn't end up in one of the groups was pretty much useless for anything other than one-make racing. They were assigned Group X, which in reality just meant they didn't have a group. In GT7, Group X is no more because non-group race cars can still be used in other ways via their relative performance point level. But in most cases, such as the World Touring Car 700 events, the game still clearly intends for you to use a Group 4 car, as all of the AI opponents do. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, these cars are used much more widely than in say GT4 or GT5. Despite GT7's sorry excuse for a career, there's still no way you can miss them like in some of those older games. But at the same time, partly why GT7's career feels so uninspired is because of stuff like this, how the groups are so rigidly defined. It's of course a necessity for sport mode, where the cars are equalized with a balance of performance system, but from a casual single-player perspective, I find it very unimaginative and unnecessary. It's worth noting that GT7 does currently have one GT300 car, and it's classed in Group 3. This is as a result of GT300 cars getting more powerful over time, now being roughly equivalent to GT3 machines. That said, I am intrigued to see what they'll do if they bring back some of the older GT300s. They could put them in Group 3 as well to keep it consistent with the BRZ, or simply base it on their raw performance, like with the Alpha 155, and put them in Group 4 anyway. So I think that by now I've firmly established my point. These lower end race cars are often underutilized in these games. But is there a specific reason why? Well, I have a theory. To me, it all comes down to the performance bracket of these cars and how they fit into the traditional Gran Turismo career. The main issue I see is that they simply don't most of the time. The progression curve of these games has you starting with slow economy cars and gradually working your way up to the top end race cars. This means that at some point you need to transition from road cars to race cars. However, the way this tends to end up happening is that you jump from some of the more powerful road cars straight into the mid-tier GT cars. Think GT500 in the older games, equivalent to Group 3 in current day. By doing this, the games effectively skip over these lower end race cars and don't really give players a reason to ever use them, unless they want to upgrade them and race them against the faster stuff, as I mentioned before. What often doesn't help is their pricing. In the older games, these types of cars, excluding racing modified ones, were quite expensive, costing several hundreds of thousands of credits. For that amount of money, you could buy a pretty fast road car and do some upgrades, like racing tires, brakes, suspension, etc., and end up with a much faster car. To their credit, it seems like Polyphony realised this somewhat in the PS3 era, as these older cars had their values slashed considerably. But now in GT7, almost every Group 4 car costs 350,000 credits, and with the much more detailed upgrade system, you can create some much faster cars for that money. The only reason why these Group 4 cars are still so prominent in the single player is because of the group system, as I mentioned, meaning that you're basically forced to use them whether you like it or not. It's not an ideal solution. So, if I were in charge, how would I handle these types of cars? Well, I believe that a better balance could be struck with the structure of the career itself. The idea would be to have these cars stand on their own merits, like they did pre-GT Sport, but making sure there's a wide enough event pool for them to actually have purpose. This could then be supplemented by giving them as prize cars at an earlier point in the career than we typically see. Then, by making the events for them give gradually faster race cars as prizes, I think this would offer an ideal entry point to the race car events, making it clear that this is the intended path and rewarding players appropriately, but at the same time not forcing them into it. That kind of mentality in other areas is what made the older GT games so much fun to play through. But is this something that you've ever thought about when playing these games? And do you have any solutions of your own? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. For me, this is something I only really noticed after playing through each of these games again over the past couple of years, and I just thought it was an interesting conversation to have. I'm not really surprised it hasn't been picked up on by more people, because it is a pretty niche topic to make a video about, but here we are. As always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.